We're here at the National Postal Forum. I'm Jody Barenblatt from Grayhair Advisors, and we've got a panel of experts on global mailing. And so I'll ask them to introduce themselves.
Mark Zazila, APC Postal Logistics.
Marty Shaw with Global Z International.
Mary Law with Worldview LLC.
And Barry Burns, Global Business, U.S. Postal Service.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about how one mails outside the United States. And if you thought it was complicated mailing inside the United States, there's quite a lot of issues in terms of getting your mail delivered outside the United States. And we've got a few topics we wanted to discuss, and we're certainly taking questions from the audience, and that's going to be the agenda. So first, to talk about the very beginning. So how is it that we capture the names and addresses of the people that we need to mail to, and what's the best way to do that in terms of managing the address quality, which is a critical aspect, of course, of getting anything delivered. So tell us what you think.
Sure. So one of the most important things is to be flexible with your data capture. So it is going to change over time. Worldview can certainly show with each of the publications that they release that countries are changing the format of their addresses, so the database has to be very flexible to change. And will it be all Roman characters that you'll be storing, or will there be local language characters, multi-byte characters? So flexibility is key, and it will no doubt change over time. And to validate it at capture, there's no better place or time to assure that your data is accurate than at point of capture.
So how does that work, Mary?
Well, I'm going to talk about capture for a moment first, but one of the things that's really significant about international addresses is that they're longer than domestic addresses. You can't fit a British address into a US format, or a Japanese address into a US format. So you need to allow the extra space, both the number of lines and the length of lines, and length of lines becomes particularly important when you're looking at Northern Europe and Eastern Europe. And yes, validating the address. There are a number of software applications that can validate at capture or immediately after capture to make sure that the address you've got is correct before you spend all the money to mail it.
And not just the length. There are differences, of course, in the length of address between, say, Europe or other countries and the United States, but the formatting is different. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in the United States, where our zip code appears after the city and state,
yes,
in many countries, the postcode, as it's usually called, often appears before the city, and maybe if there's a province, depending on the country, but it's before the city rather than after the city, which is what we're used to here in the United States.
So does the Postal Service counsel mailers on how to go global?
Well, we do in many ways, and there are many aspects to going global beyond the addressing component. And the Postal Service, of course, has many different products available for everything from the direct marketer who is trying to acquire customers. And there's still some transactional mail that goes on even in this day and age. And of course the fulfillment, which is where everyone is expanding into the different types of parcel services. And we have a whole range of services which vary by speed and some of the service features available. And of course they're priced accordingly.
Yeah. So Mark, you want to tell us about your experience with the data collection aspect of global addressing?
Well, I think one of the mistakes that people make is assuming because they got an address on their website that the user created, that people assume that it's going to be correct. And what we see a lot of times, we're at the end of the chain preparing the mail for delivery, and very often people send us either lists to use, or they send us pre-addressed mail, parcels, and the addresses are invalid. Something's been left out, the person who wrote their address forgot something. It happens domestically also. It's the reason that you have address correction software and address update software for domestic. Surprisingly, people just don't really know their addresses as well as they should.
So what are some of the challenges associated with getting the data capture right and making sure that the addresses are valid? I'm sure there's organizational challenges related to that. Most companies don't necessarily out of the gate decide that they're going global. It often happens that customers come to them and they've already got a database set up and they just didn't think about something that is necessary in terms of managing addresses outside the United States.
I find one of the common challenges we see with organizations which find themselves dealing with international data, either by design, they pursued it strategically, or they're seeing international customers come to them, is that there can be a marketing silo and a IT or IS silo, and both need to be at the table to design and assure that that database is functional and works for the whole organization. So having them play nice, as it were, through the process is really important so that their ultimate customer is able to transact with them and interact with them.
Do you find yourself a conductor in that role?
I occasionally find myself a conductor in that world. It's a process that has to go through from the data collection, through the data storage, into the print medium. You know, at some point, if you're mailing something, you're going to print that address out. The print format has to be capable of reflecting the address correctly. The database has to be capable of storing it correctly. And the collection forms, or whatever device is being used for collecting, have to be able to collect it correctly. So it's really a process and a flow through the whole thing. And as Mark was saying, he gets it at the end point and he's seeing what happened somewhere down that chain. It may not be the printing or the collection. It could be anywhere in that chain.
Mm-hmm.
I often find working for the Postal Service when a customer may come to us and say, you know, we did a mailing and it took maybe longer than it should have, to be delivered. Now we know there are always factors such as, weather and, holiday times, things like that.
A few wars.
There are certainly things that are happening around the world. But I always ask about the address. And lots of people just assume that the address is correct and that it was formatted correctly and that it was actually printed on the mail piece correctly. You'd be surprised sometimes that there are just mechanical problems in the production of the mail piece. And whenever possible, I ask that customer, is it possible to provide an image of what that label looked like?
Great.
And it has certainly happened where once you eyeball the label and you see the address, you can see what the problem was. And you don't know for sure, but it's a good chance that was the cause of the delivery or the misdelivery or the delayed delivery. And I think oftentimes when we have those discussions, the customers are a little surprised because they haven't even thought that there might be a possibility that there was an issue with the address.
I think, Barry, to your point, I think it really involves starting at the beginning of the chain rather than the end. People think of delivery problems as being at the end of the chain very often, and they come to us for that kind of information too. And when they'll tell us a package didn't get delivered or a mail piece was late, they'll ask why, and I often tell them the same thing. Let's go back to the very beginning, look at your database first, and then all the steps leading up to printing the label. And more often than not, you find that's part of the problem.